Recall, but there is more. Since the hidden bearing of George Washington, his life and name, on Washington, D.C., has been dealt with in the previous presentation, now the focus of study will be upon Washington, D.C., its design and construction, and upon the District of Columbia itself. First, Washington. L'Enfant Plan of Washington, D.C., 1791. Here's Washington, D.C. Notice in the upper half this strange figure. Taking a closer look at the figure's location in Washington. Notice this street, this street, this street, this street, and this street. But closing off, completing the figure, requires running through lots. A pentagram or five-pointed star. Why though? Why is it here? What does it mean? Recall that Washington, D.C. is a Masonic capital, founded in Masonry. Perhaps the answer to the pentagram lies in Masonry. The blazing star. Our source? Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871-1905. The location of our first quote. The blazing star of 5 points, page 14. The location of our second quote. 5 is the duad added to the triad. It is expressed by the 5-pointed or blazing star, the mysterious pentalpha of Pythagoras, page 58. The location of our third quote. That same blazing star, the image whereof we find in all initiations, to the Kabbalist the sacred pentagram, page 842. The blazing star. Our second source and the location of our quote. Speaking of the blazing star, the Masonic star is made with 5 points. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 118. Returning back to Washington, D.C., what is this? According to Pike and Mackey, the pentagram, the 5-pointed star, is the Masonic blazing star. But what is the blazing star? Does Pike in Morals and Dogma have anything to say on the matter? The location of our quote. The ornaments of a lodge are said to be the mosaic pavement, the indented tessel, and the blazing star. The mosaic pavement, checkered in squares or lozenges, and the indented tessel, that beautiful tessellated border which surrounded it. The blazing star in the center. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871-1905, page 14. What about Mackey? In An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, does he have anything to say on the matter? The location of our quote. In the Ritual of 1735, it, the blazing star, is detailed as a part of the furniture of a lodge, with the explanation that the mosaic pavement is the ground floor of the lodge, the blazing star, the center, and the indented tarsal, the border round about it. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 116. The same information can be gotten directly from a much older source. The blazing star. Our source and the location of our quote. Question. Have you any furniture in your lodge? Answer. Yes. Question. What is it? Answer. Mosaic pavement, blazing star, and indented tarsal. Question. What are they? Answer. Mosaic pavement, the ground floor of the lodge, blazing star, the center, and indented tarsal, the border round about it. Pritchard Samuel, Masonry Dissected, London, printed for J. Wilford at the 3 Flower de Luces, behind the chapter house, near St. Paul's, 1730, page 13. Here's the 7th edition of 1737 of the same source, perhaps a slightly cleaner scan of the source, as well as a slightly better preserved source. The source and the location of our quote. The quote, which was read previously, the mosaic pavement, the ground floor of the lodge, blazing star the center, and indented tarsal, the border round about it. Pritchard Samuel, Masonry Dissected, 7th edition, London, printed for T. Cooper at the Globe in Pater Noster Row, 1737, page 13. Here's a cover image from the magazine The Blazing Star, issue volume 1, number 1, February 15, 1923, the organ of the International Society of Masonic Research. Notice the displayed image of the blazing star. Mackey says, and I quote, "The blazing star is not to be confounded with the 5-pointed star." Mackey, page 116. The Masonic star is made with 5 points, but the error has been committed in all our modern tracing boards of making the star with straight points, which form, of course, does not represent a blazing star. Guillaume says, all stars should be made with waved points, because our eyes tremble at beholding them. Mackey, page 118. The point I am trying to make with this quote is that even if it can be said on technical grounds that the pentagram of Washington, D.C. is not a blazing star, still it must be conceded by my opponents that most of the detail of the blazing star must be dropped, leaving just a pentagram purely by the constraints of the employed medium, that of city-street planning. Another image of the blazing star. Another. 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 And another. The point being made is that the blazing star has quite a bit of variation in how it is displayed, but pretty much universally it always contains at least a 5-pointed star or pentagram, and thus so can the pentagram of Washington, D.C. Now what of the mosaic pavement? Here we clearly see the furniture of the lodge, the mosaic pavement, the indented tarsal around its edge, and the blazing star in its center. Now we will just quickly go through a number of examples. Another. A picture of the same from a different angle. Another mosaic pavement. Another. Don't miss the blazing star. Another mosaic pavement. Another. Another. A picture of the same from a different angle. Another mosaic pavement. A picture of the same from a different angle. Another mosaic pavement. Another. 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 A picture of the same from a different angle. So to summarize, in general, the blazing star consists of at least one 5-pointed star, and it sits in the center of a generally black and white mosaic pavement. Returning back to Washington, D.C. But what is the blazing star? We have no complete answer yet, but we know its location. Imagine a mosaic pavement, an imaginary lodge ground floor in Washington, D.C. The blazing star lies at the center of this mosaic pavement. But what is the orientation of this mosaic pavement, lodge ground floor, or in other words, the lodge? How can we know what the orientation is? Does Pike in Morals and Dogma have anything to say on the matter? The location of our quote. Our lodges are said to be due east and west, because the master represents the rising sun, and of course must be in the east. Pike Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871-1905, page 366. What about Mackey, in an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry? Does he have anything to say on the matter? The location of our quote. The orientation of a lodge is its situation due east and west. Although Masonic lodges are still, when circumstances will permit, built in an east and west direction, the explanation of the usage contained in the old lectures of the last century, that it was because all chapels and churches are, or ought to be so, has become obsolete, and other symbolic reasons are assigned. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 555. Returning back to Washington, D.C. So what is the orientation of the mosaic pavement, lodge ground floor, lodge? Here is north. The mosaic pavement, lodge ground floor, lodge is oriented due east and west. Recall George Washington. There are a series of lithographs of him. I have 4, the only 4 the government had, all of the same type. Here is one, another, another, and the last. Why the lithographs? Why all so similar, of the same type? Washington is a symbol. Removing the clutter leaves a simple message. George Washington is a symbol for Washington, D.C. Notice his foundation, the mosaic pavement. Washington, D.C. is founded by in masonry, containing a half-hidden. Switching to the first lithograph. What is that half-hidden behind Washington? Zooming in. The blazing star. What is the blazing star that Washington, D.C. contains? Why is it so important to Washington, D.C.? Returning back to Washington, D.C., what is this blazing star that Washington, D.C. contains? Does Pike in Morals and Dogma have anything to say on the matter? The location of our first 2 quotes. The sun and moon, the male and the female, their offspring, the blazing star or Horus. Pike Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, pages 13 through 14. The blazing star is said to be an emblem of divine providence. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 14. The location of our next 5 quotes. Originally, the blazing star, represented Sirius, or the dog star, the god Anubis. Then it became the image of Horus. It was Hermes also, whose name in Greek is that of the god Mercury. The blazing star or glory in the center refers us to that grand luminary, the sun. The blazing star has been regarded as an emblem of omniscience, or the all-seeing eye. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 15. What about Mackey? In an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, does he have anything to say on the matter? The location of our next 5 quotes. The blazing star is the first and most exalted object that demands our attention in the lodge. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 116. Why the most exalted? The blazing star or glory in the center. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 116. Why the glory in the center? The blazing star is symbolic of a true Mason, who by perfecting himself in the way of truth, that is to say, by advancing in knowledge, becomes like a blazing star, shining with brilliancy in the midst of darkness. The star is therefore a symbol of truth. The star is again said to be a symbol of the light of divine providence, pointing out the way of truth. This symbol, the blazing star, is called the star of direction. It still retains in a remoter sense its usual signification as an emblem of divine providence, guiding and directing the pilgrim in his journey through life. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 116. The location of our next 2 quotes. The blazing star is subsequently explained as hieroglyphically representing divine providence. The blazing star, or glory in the center, refers us to the sun. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 117. The location of our next 3 quotes. This dog star, the Anubis of the Egyptians, is the blazing star of Masonry. The hieroglyphic language proves that the star, the blazing star, was a symbol of God. The great architect of the universe is therefore symbolized in Freemasonry by the blazing star, as the herald of our salvation. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 118. All of which, both the quotes of Mackey and Pike, is summarized by this last quote, an unread quote from page 117. In the hieroglyphical system the star denoted a god, a statement which he gives force by a quote from the Bible. The star of your God, Amos 5:26. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 117. It should be noted that star equals God is paganism's symbolism, not God's or the Bible's. Returning back to Washington, D.C. So what is this blazing star that Washington, D.C. contains? Recall that Freemasonry is ecumenical, non-sectarian. From what our sources said, the blazing star is Anubis, Horus, Hermes or Mercury, the Sun, the all-seeing eye, truth, or more precisely, the source of truth, divine providence, God, the great architect of the universe. In short, the blazing star is a god. But what god? In pursuit of this answer, we will pursue another line of questioning. What is the mosaic pavement? The ground floor of what? Does Pike in Morals and Dogma have anything to say on the matter? The location of our first quote. The mosaic pavement, checkered in squares or lozenges, is said to represent the ground floor of King Solomon's temple, and the indented tessel, that beautiful tessellated border which surrounded it. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 14. The location of our second quote. Every lodge is a temple. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 7. What about Mackey? In an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, does he have anything to say on the matter? The location of our first quote. The Masonic tradition is that the floor of the Temple of Solomon was decorated with a mosaic pavement of black and white stones. As the lodge is a representation of the temple, that the floor of the lodge should also be of the same pattern. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 510. The location of our next quote. Masonry thus makes the temple the symbol of a lodge. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 795. The location of our next quote. Each lodge is and must be a symbol of the Jewish temple. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 798. The location of our next quote. All Masonic lodges, like their great prototype, the Temple of Jerusalem, are built, or supposed to be built, due east and west. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 237. The location of our next quote. The idea of a separation into a holy and a most holy place is maintained in the construction of Masonic lodges, which are but imitations in spirit of the ancient temples. But there has been a transposition of parts, the most holy place, which with the Jews was in the west, being placed in lodges in the east. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 796. The location of our next quote. This, the oblong square, is the symbolic form of a Masonic lodge, and it finds its prototype in many of the structures of our ancient brethren. The Temple of Solomon were all oblong squares. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 542. The location of our next quote. Corn, wine, and oil are the Masonic elements of consecration. The tabernacle in the wilderness and all its holy vessels were by God's express command anointed with oil. Hence, Freemasons' lodges, which are but temples to the Most High, are consecrated to the sacred purposes for which they were built by strewing corn, wine, and oil upon the lodge. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 187. The location of our next quote. It was not until 1832 that the first independent hall was built in that city, Boston, which received the name of the Masonic Temple, a title which has since been very usually conferred on the halls in the larger cities. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 328. The location of our next quote. Masonic temples or lodge rooms. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 620. Returning back to Washington, D.C. So what is the mosaic pavement? The ground floor of what? So many characteristics of the Masonic Lodge point to it being a temple, its prototype being the Hebrew Jewish Tabernacle Temple. 1. Its floor pattern, the mosaic pavement of black and white stones of the Temple of Solomon of Masonic tradition. 2. Its orientation, due east and west. 3. Its shape, an oblong square. 4. That it has a most holy place. 5. That it is consecrated to holy use with oil, the Masonic consecrated corn, oil, and wine. And 6. That it is even called a temple, a Masonic temple. However, Washington, D.C. is not a physical lodge temple. Can the Masonic temple be spiritual? Do either of our two sources, Pike in Morals and Dogma, and Mackey in An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, have anything to say on the matter? The location of our first quote. I should illustrate the train of ideas by which the Freemasons were led to symbolize the Temple of Solomon as a spiritual temple of man's nature by borrowing the language of St. Peter, who says to his Christian initiates, "Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house," and with greater emphasis, and as still more illustrative, would I cite the language of the Apostle of the Gentiles, that apostle who, of all others, most delighted in symbolism, and who says, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 672. The location of our next quote. Freemasons are occupied in the construction of a moral and spiritual temple, And in this symbolism, the Freemasons have only developed the same idea that was present to St. Paul when he said to the Corinthians that they were God's building, of which building he, as a wise master builder, had laid the foundation. And when still further extending the metaphor, he told the Ephesians that they were built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto a holy temple in the Lord, in whom also ye are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. This then is the true art of Freemasonry, to build up in man a holy house for the habitation of God's Spirit, to give perfection to man's nature, to give purity to humanity, and to unite mankind in one common bond. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 673. The location of our last quote: Solomon's Temple is viewed as a symbol of that spiritual temple formed by the aggregation of the whole order, and in which each Mason is considered as a stone. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 782. Returning back to Washington, D.C. But there is no physical building. Can the Masonic Temple be spiritual? Yes, the Temple of Washington, D.C.'s pentagram is a spiritual one. And in Peter and Paul's concept of the church as a temple, sets up an anti-Christian church. That is, a church standing in the place of the true Christian church. I would remind you that Freemasonry is not Christian, but ecumenical, willing to accept error as well as truth. The location of our first quote: If Masonry were simply a Christian institution, the Jew and the Muslim, the Brahmin and the Buddhist, could not conscientiously partake of its illumination. But its universality is its boast. In its language, citizens of every nation may converse. At its altar, men of all religions may kneel. To its creed, disciples of every faith may subscribe. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 163. The location of our next quote: The Bible is used among Masons as the symbol of the will of God. Therefore, whatever to any people expresses that will may be used as a substitute. Thus, in a lodge consisting entirely of Jews, the Old Testament alone may be placed upon the altar, and Turkish Masons make use of the Koran, whether it be the Gospels to the Christian, the Pentateuch to the Israelite, the Koran to the Mussulman, or the Vedas to the Brahmin. It everywhere Masonically conveys the same idea, that of the symbolism of the divine will revealed to man. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 114. The location of our next quote: The Bible is an indispensable part of the furniture of a Christian lodge, only because it is the sacred book of the Christian religion. The Hebrew Pentateuch in a Hebrew lodge, and the Koran in a Mohammedan one, belong on the altar, and one of these, and the square and compass, properly understood, are the great lights by which a Mason must walk and work. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree of the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 11. The location of our last quote: Mystic tie, that sacred and inviolable bond which unites men of the most discordant opinions into one band of brothers, which gives but one language to men of all nations and one altar to men of all religions, is properly, from the mysterious influence it exerts, denominated the mystic tie; and Freemasons, because they alone are under its influence or enjoy its benefits, are called brethren of the mystic tie. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 517. Returning back to Washington, D.C., ecumenical and thus an anti-Christian church indeed. Recall Mackey's quote of Peter, "Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house." 1 Peter 2:5. Peter continues with, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people." 1 Peter 2:9. Is it possible? Did Freemasons believe they were building up an holy nation when they brought into being the United States of America? Do they still believe that? Do they believe they are building up a new Babel, a new united world, now, at present, a new world order? Returning to the spiritual temple of Washington, D.C. Recall the blazing star represents a god. What god? Masonry's temple gives some other characteristics. What kind of a temple is this? Recall the Masonic Lodge. Recall specifically the mosaic pavement. What does the black and white symbolize? Does Pike in Morals and Dogma have anything to say on the matter? The location of our first quote. The pavement alternately black and white symbolizes, whether so intended or not, the good and evil principles of the Egyptian and Persian creed. Pike, Albert, Morals and Dogma, Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd Degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1871, 1905, page 14. What about Mackey in an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry? Does he have anything to say on the matter? The location of our second and last quote. Its partly colored stones of black and white have been readily and appropriately interpreted as symbols of the evil and good. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 510. Returning back to Washington, D.C. and our temple. So what kind of temple is this? Rather than a pure temple and God, a yin-yang mixture of good and evil. Bring into mind, "Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Genesis 3:5. What kind of a temple is this? What more can be said? Recall that both the tabernacle, temple, and Masonic lodges lie due east and west. Recall that they also face in opposite directions. The most holy place of the tabernacle temple is placed in the west end of the structure, while in the lodge it is placed in the east end. Why? The location of our first quote, in a sense. Mackey's Lodge Diagram. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 476. So this is the layout of a lodge compared with the layout of the tabernacle temple. In the east lies the rising sun. Note the following: the entrances to the lodge. lie in the west, while the entrance to the tabernacle temple lies in the east. The lodge worshippers face towards the east, while the tabernacle temple worshippers face towards the west. The lodge worshippers, because they face towards the rising sun, are thus sun worshippers, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun towards the east. Ezekiel 8:16. Does Mackey in an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry have anything to say with regards to this? Yes. Obviously, he would never admit to Masons being sun worshippers, but the location of our second quote, our first in the real sense. The sun was the object of adoration. The spot, the east, therefore, where this luminary made his appearance at the commencement of day, and where his worshippers were wont anxiously to look for the first darting of his prolific rays, was esteemed as the figurative birthplace of their god, and honored with an appropriate degree of reverence. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 237. The location of our next quote. The veneration which Masons have for the East bears a relation to the primitive religion whose first degeneration was sun worship. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 238. The location of our last quote. From the Mithraic initiations, in which sun worship played so important a part, the Gnostics derived many of their symbols. These again exercised their influence upon the medieval Freemasons. Thus it is that the sun has become so prominent in the Masonic system, not of course as an object of worship. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 766. Returning back to Washington, D.C. and our temple. What kind of a temple is this? What more can be said? Not only does it contain a yin-yang mixture of good and evil, but also sun worship. What kind of a temple is this? What more can be said? Recall the setup of the camp of Israel in their wilderness wanderings. The setup of this camp in relation to the tabernacle. Recall the standards of the camp of Israel, the standards assigned to the four main camps, and thus implicitly assigned to the four directions, east, south, west, and north. Returning back to Washington, D.C. and our temple. What kind of temple is this? What more can be said? Applying the camp of Israel's standards, the tabernacle's symbolic directions to Washington, D.C.'s temple, beginning with a decluttered temple. Recall that north points up. The lion in the east, the man in the south, the bull in the west, and the eagle in the north. The lion, man, and bull are all earthbound creatures, and thus they represent earth, while the eagle is sky soaring, and thus it represents heaven. But Masonry has a serious problem in the north, heaven. The location of our first quote. The north is esteemed a place of darkness. The east, on the contrary, is considered a place of light. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 237. The location of our second quote: a lodge has 3 symbolic lesser lights. One of these is in the east, one in the west, and one in the south. There is no light in the north. The north we therefore Masonically call a place of darkness. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 465. Returning back to Washington, D.C. and our temple. But Masonry has a serious problem in the north, heaven. Heaven, the north, is dark to Masonry. Masonry has no heavenly light, truth. Only earthly light, truth, of which its greatest source is the sun or sun god, which is the blazing star, as will be seen shortly. Returning to the temple, a yin-yang mixture of good and evil, and also sun worship, to which is added darkness, as in no heavenly light. But the blazing star, a god, but what god? The answer lies here, and with Mackey in An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. The location of our quote: the blazing star is symbolic of a true Mason. Mackey, Albert G., An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Philadelphia, Moss & Co., 1874, page 116. But what is a Mason? The blazing star is symbolic of a true man. Occult imagery from the 16th century. The pentagram and the occult. Our sources, the original Latin and its English translation. Because of the age of the sources, we will take the time to accurately locate our pages of interest. The book contents. Turning the page over, we come to Capitum Libri Secundi Elencus, the chapter listing for Book 2. Book 2, Chapter 1, starting on page 99. Where our chapter of interest, found in the second column, is Caput Viginte Septem, chapter 27, De Humani Corporis Proportion e Mensura Harmoniac, of the proportion, measure, and harmony of man's body, page 160. Now to the actual start of the book, page 1. Flipping forward a few pages, we come to page 99. Liber Secundus, Book 2. Flipping forward more pages, we come to page 160. De Humani Corporis Proportion e Mensura Harmoniac, of the proportion, measure, and harmony of man's body, Caput Viginte Septem, chapter 27. Flipping forward a few more pages to page 163, we arrive at our quote. A picture answering to the description of Mackey, a pentagram man. Agrippa von Nettensheim, Enrich Cornelius, De Occulta Philosophia, Libre 3, Libre 2, Caput Viginte Septem, Collignier, Caesariae Majestatis, 1533, page 163. Returning to Washington, D.C. and its pentagram god, what is the answer given by heaven north and earth east, west, and south, and Mackey? A man fallen from heaven to earth is the god in Washington, D.C., the god that Masons worship as the blazing star, the god they worship in their lodge temples. Didn't Pike mention this god? The location of our quote. Lucifer, the light bearer. Strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light, and with its splendors, intolerable, blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not. Pike Albert, Morals and Dogma. Charleston, published by the Supreme Council of the 33rd Degree for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States. 1871, 1905, page 321. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. Isaiah 14:12. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Revelation 12:9. Just as Pike said, Lucifer is the light bearer, but only for Masons, for this blazing star is a black light of deception, and Masons, specifically Christian Masons, have allowed themselves to be deceived because they have not believed God's word. Now it all makes sense. This falling star, blazing with light as it burns up and nears extermination, a fallen angel. For recall, stars are angels according to Revelation 1:20. This falling star, fallen angel, who sits in the Masonic temple as a god, recall his story was seen before, but it will be good to relate it again, differently this time. This falling star, fallen angel, sitting in the Masonic temple as a god is Lucifer, the morning star, having as a goal to be like God and receive the worship of all. Recall, he fell from heaven, was cast out with his angels, because his heart's desire was to overthrow God's government, and he attempted it and failed. He imagined himself ascending above the clouds, ascending up into heaven. He imagined himself as God, ruling over the angel throngs of heaven and receiving their worship. Seated on the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, that is, seated on the Ark of the Covenant, God's throne, between the two cherubim, in the temple, on the Temple Mount. But it was all just a dream, and he was cast out. But he did not give up. Having failed in heaven, he set up a front man on the earth to do what he could not accomplish in heaven. The little horn power of Daniel 7, or that man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. And he succeeded. This man of sin, the son of perdition, the Roman Catholic pontiff, set himself up in the earthly temple of God, the church, and received worship as God by the deceived majority of Christendom. And Lucifer, to receive the same worship from Reformed Protestants and pagans alike, created Freemasonry, making himself a second temple, and set himself up in it, and deceived man followed on. How can we be so certain?